The future is a concept. It doesn't exist. As the proverb says, tomorrow never comes. There is no such thing as tomorrow. There never will be, because time is always now.
Welcome to the Philosophical Minds Podcast, the podcast about the stuff we wonder about
and other things.
All right, we are here with Rick Strassman, author and clinical professor of psychiatry, the first person in the U.S. to undertake government-approved human research with psychedelic, hallucinogenic, or entheogenic substances. Most will be familiar with Rick's work in regards to the book and documentary film DMT The Spirit Molecule. He has published nearly 30 peer-reviewed scientific papers, and his recent works include Joseph Levy Escapes Death, as well as DMT and the Soul of Prophecy. So, I really admire your approach, both scientifically as well as spiritually. You know, in the interviews I've watched or listened to of yours, you present the data from a balanced and unbiased perspective, as far as I can tell. And, you go about your work very carefully. And in regards to your Jewish studies, you don't really belong to a community, from what I understand. You don't really have a consistent relationship with a rabbi or anything like that. You just kind of study and try to understand what the Hebrew Bible is saying by studying the language and philology and grammar, etc. So I think that's awesome. So I just wanted to say I admire that.
Good. I appreciate your comments.
Yeah. So you've written a book, DMT and the Soul of Prophecy. I recently said in a podcast to someone, if they're interested in communion with God, that the psychedelic substances may be their best bet, if done correctly. And I'm sure that doesn't apply across the board, of course, but would you agree or disagree with that? How do you see it?
Well, I mean, it depends on what you mean by God, and it also depends on what you mean by knowing God. According to the traditional Jewish philosophers, at least the ones from the Middle Ages, which I've studied mostly. One can only approach the glory of God. You can never become one with God. It's never the case of it's all one. There's always a difference between you and God. But you can get closer and closer through study, prayer, prophecy. But it's also believed that you can't really comprehend or apprehend God. All you're able to approach when you approach God is God's glory, which is the manifestation of God that we can comprehend or apprehend. By definition, God's incomprehensible and invisible. So you need to kind of take one step, lower than, I guess, pure God or the fundamental God, the one God. And then you can approach the glory of the divine. The glory is kind of a reflection, kind of a shadow. But when you're talking about such abstract and high-level concepts, even the shadow is pretty much above and beyond anything that we're usually used to.
Definitely. From your perspective, do you view God kind of as a primary creative or creator force or source of some kind? Is that kind of how you would articulate?
The way I first got into the notion of the existence of God and God's attributes, characteristics, his behavior, as it were, was through thinking about cause and effect from the Buddhist point of view. And if you look at cause and effect, it isn't completely random. It seems to reflect the workings of some higher, more abstract level of organization. And even though Buddhism, teaches that every effect has got causes. In other words, cause and effect always existed. That's not our experience of anything in this world. Everything is created, exists, and then passes away. I mean, that's one of the fundamental teachings of Buddhism. So why doesn't cause and effect have a beginning and a existence and then a passing away? So I kind of got my first toehold on the notion of God as the creator and sustainer of cause and effect. The natural world was created, and the laws of nature are sustained by God. So then you could work backwards, as it were, and reflect on God's characteristics or God's attributes by studying nature. For example, the laws of nature reflect a higher level of organization. So you can abstract increasingly to get a approximation of what God may be like. Your earlier question about if psychedelics can have spiritual import, can they help one's spiritual development? It depends. The main thing about the psychedelics is they work on you. They don't kind of create new ideas, new feelings, new emotions, new memories. Rather they work on what you bring to the experience. So if you bring to the experience a confused mind, let's say you love evil, you want to become more evil. Psychedelics can, in a way, they can amplify what's already there. Your more or less conscious wishes, desires, impulses, and so on. So if you would like to become a more spiritual person as a result of taking psychedelics, then you need to also be becoming a more spiritual person off of psychedelics. In other words, you need to be making your spiritual growth a priority. You study, you pray, you are in a community, you have a teacher, those kinds of things. In which case, psychedelic can work on a richer soil than if it was just a so depressed, uneducated, bad intentioned kind of person. So most of the work on psychedelics occurs off of psychedelics. They just kind of amplify what's already there, or shed a light on it, or make it more true, or real, or more compelling somehow.
Now, in regards to your recent work, DMT and the Soul of Prophecy, what are some of the major similarities that you find between prophetic experiences versus psychedelic experiences, and what are some of the major differences?
Well, the major resemblances are phenomenological. If you compare the two experiences, the visions and the voices, the emotions, the physical sensations, those all are pretty well mirrored one state to the other. If you read the first chapter of Ezekiel and his vision of the chariot, it's completely DMT-like. There's beings, there's the sound of rushing water. He's taken up into space by an angel who grabs him by the hair. He sees flaming angels, with eyes on their wings, spinning wheels. He's just completely terrified, blown away, falls on his face. So if you compared like Ezekiel's vision with a high dose of DMT, and you just compared the phenomenological features, the visions and the voices, the emotions, those kinds of things, there's a tremendous amount of overlap. But if you think about most people's DMT experiences, they, really don't hold a candle to the prophetic experiences which are recorded in the Hebrew Bible. They're a lot more enduring. Isaiah, everybody's heard of Isaiah and Ezekiel and Jeremiah. Moses, Abraham. They all were. They were all, prophets who experienced a prophetic state of consciousness. So the typical, DMT experience isn't, nearly as rich in verbal information compared to the, textual states. The ideas contained in the Hebrew prophetic literature have endured for thousands of years. They form the basis of Western civilization. Our philosophy, theology, economics, politics, everything is rooted in the Hebrew Bible. Christianity is rooted in the Hebrew Bible. If it weren't, for the Hebrew Bible, there would be no Christianity. So, the content of the prophetic state is extremely richer than the content, the verbal, cognitive information, which is either contained in the DMT state or which is available for retrieval by people in the DMT state. So that isn't, to say, that there isn't that information in the DMT state, but at least for most people who use DMT or use any psychedelic, it may be more of the case that people aren't able to recognize, the information that's in that state, or extract it, somehow, gain verbal comprehension of it. So that's one of the boons which we can talk about later. Of using the Hebrew Bible as almost a guidebook for how to get the most out of your psychedelic experiences.
Definitely. Now, somebody you mentioned that I hadn't heard of until I listened to you. It was a classic medieval Jewish philosopher, and I think it was Maimonides or something. I'm not sure how to pronounce that, but who was that, and how did he inform some of your thinking?
Yeah, well, you are thinking about Maimonides, Moses ben Maimon. So Maimonides, was born in Spain or Iberia, and all the Jews were chased out of Spain and Iberia, first by the Muslims, then by the Christians, then by the Muslims. So Maimonides and his family fled to North Africa, and then they moved to Egypt, Fastat. And Maimonides, was a rabbi, quite esteemed. He distilled all of the Talmud into a handful of books, and just kind of extracted all of the Talmudic information, figured out the majority opinions on areas that were controversial. He just kind of spelled everything out, very cut and dried, and that's still the major handbook, for observant Jews. Maimonides' interpretation of the Torah, which he wrote 800 years ago, 900 years ago. But he was also a philosopher, and he was influenced by Aristotle, by Plato, and by the Muslim, philosopher of the time, Avicenna, Averroes, Ibn Sina. So they all, the Arabic, philosophers were the first to translate Aristotle. And then the Jews, who could read Arabic, then were, became familiar with Aristotle, through the Muslim philosophers. So they were quite concerned with the idea of the prophetic state. Who is a prophet? What are the qualifications? When does prophecy devolve upon someone and why? And what are the mechanisms? And most importantly, what is the information? So Maimonides was quite systematic, both as an organizer of the Talmud and also as a philosopher. And one of his major works is called The Guide of the Perplexed. And and it's called that because of his wish to help people who were Jewish and traditional and held to the tradition, but also were curious and scientifically minded and influenced by the rationalism of the Greeks. So Maimonides wanted to clear the perplexity of a believing Jew that was still scientifically inclined, philosophically inclined. So one of his tasks was to clear up the anthropomorphisms in the Hebrew Bible. God's hand, God's face, God's anger, his love, his speaking, those kinds of things, which can't occur if God is invisible, non-material and incomprehensible. So Maimonides, for example, if the text speaks about God's hand, it's metaphoric for God's authority. Kind of like by the hand of the king that I've been made a representative of. So hand and authority equate with each other. So Maimonides goes through the whole text and explains and explains the anthropomorphisms, the anthropopathisms too, the emotions which God is supposed to feel. There's an expression, the Torah is written in the language of man, which means that it is written for the most possible, for the largest possible audience. So you don't want to get too abstract about God's authority, like what's God's authority. But if you talk about God's hand, it is more relevant for uneducated people, which was the majority of the Jews back in those days. So he spends a fair amount of time with disabusing the notion of God having a form or a shape or a body. The other thing is he really spells out a theory of prophecy, which I rely on quite heavily in my formulation of how it works. It's a top-down model. God, in a way, kind of radiates downward, through spheres or levels of consciousness or what have you. But there are a finite level of intermediaries between you and God. The prophetic state occurs through cleaving or attaining knowledge of that lowest terrestrial level. Some people could think of it as the collective unconscious, but there's a more broad concept from Aristotle, which is called the active intellect. Which is a repository of every possible event, everything that's ever happened, everything that's happening now, and everything that could occur in the future. Through conjoining with the active intellect, you are able to access divine information. It might involve predicting, foretelling. It might involve the accurate historical portrayal of past events. So you can join, with an upper, level, higher in as much as it's, more abstract. It isn't, completely physical. Well, it isn't, physically based. It's more energetically field based. So you either can become capable of conjoining with the active intellect through study, prayer, and I think one of the potential uses of psychedelics is to increase your appropriateness or your state of readiness for prophecy. But I'll get back to that in a few minutes. The other way is for you just to be chosen by God. There's a set of circumstances that needs to be addressed through divine intervention, and back in the time of biblical prophecy, that's the way in which God communicated with humans. So, with respect to psychedelics making you more ready for prophecy or any kind of spiritual experience, which comes from either above or can come from below. It's through the stimulation of what's called the imagination. The Aristotelian idea of the imagination. So the imagination isn't make believe, like imaginary. It's any mental phenomena that's not abstract. So if the contents of the abstract part of the mind are thoughts, ideas, everything else is in the arena of the imagination. Feelings, perceptions, emotions, bodily things, but especially perceptions, visual perceptions and auditory perceptions. So in Maimonides' view of the way that prophecy devolves downward, is that your imagination is stimulated and your intellect is stimulated from divine influence. You can strengthen your intellect through study and virtue, but you really aren't able to do that much, at least back in the day, to stimulate your imagination. But the psychedelics, if you look at their primary effect, it's on the imagination. It isn't especially rich in information, verbal information, teachings and whatnot. But it's extremely perceptual, and it might be you can improve the function of your imaginative faculty, through the prudent, well supervised, screened, all that use of psychedelics. Lower doses most likely, but still, if you really wanted to get out there, like identify with Ezekiel's chariot, you probably want to take a large dose of whatever.
Yeah, so I guess that was going to be, I wanted to talk about your neurotheology versus theoneurology, which is your model, I believe, that posits that God communicates with us via the agency of the brain. Is that kind of correct, what you're saying?
Yeah. The reigning model of the biology of spiritual experience is neurotheology. It's your brain on drugs, or it's your brain on meditation, or it's your brain on prayer. And it's a bottom-up approach. This is your brain on drugs, and as a result, there's an epiphenomenon. All the chemicals and electricity translates into a subjective experience. Which then is called spiritual after the fact. And, the evolutionary significance of that being built into our brains is that you're more open-minded, perhaps. You're more, communal. Your perceptions might be increased. You might be more creative. You're more altruistic. So there's an evolutionary advantage to these kinds of experiences occurring as a reflex, more or less, to certain stimuli applied to the brain, your meditation, your prayer, or drugs. Theo-neurology is, my, kind of, take on it. Well, it's an alternative view, and obviously, it's going to end up being some combination thereof. But in this top-down model, God designed the brain in order to communicate with us, and increased levels of DMT produced endogenously would then mediate the forms, the perceptions in the imagination, which then would need to be extracted, the information. You've got visions, and then you need to understand what they're trying to tell you. So in my top-down model, God displays the visions through DMT into the imagination. If the whole system holds together, and then it's up to your intellect, your intelligence, to be able to understand what the visions contain. There's one of the minor prophets is a fellow named Zechariah, and Zechariah is great because he just has incredibly psychedelic visions, but he doesn't have a clue what they mean. And there's an angel in his vision with him, and he turns to the angel and he said, what do these things mean? And the angel would say, don't you know? And Zechariah would say, no, I don't know. Explain it to me. So the angel then explains what these crazy visions mean. The future of Israel, or the future of Jerusalem, or the exiles, or the Second Temple, or things like that. So you can learn how to get the information that's in the state through learning what other people have done over the millennia to try to get information from states which are quite similar.
From your understanding, does the Hebrew interpretations of encounters with angels differ at all from what we get in the English translations, or does it kind of get communicated the same, or do you see any difference in that?
Well, there's an expression, there's no translation without interpretation, which, means, that any time you choose a word to translate from one to the other language, you're making a choice. You have a number of choices that are available to you. If, there's a word if, there's a verb which expresses verbal communication from one person to the other, you could translate that word as speak, or say, or utter, or verbalize. Depending on what you understand is the larger meaning and the larger context of the text, you will choose certain definitions as compared to others. When I started to restudy the Hebrew Bible, this was 1996. I was lucky because as a young kid I went to Hebrew school and I learned modern Hebrew. Biblical Hebrew is a lot more obtuse, but still it's the same letter roots, and there's past, present, and future, and there's certain conjugations of the verb and noun. So I was able to reteach myself, biblical Hebrew, and then read directly, from the Hebrew text. In fact, I'm currently working on a translation and commentary on the Book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible, because every so often, somebody, will ask me, what's a good place to start to read a good English, translation of the Hebrew Bible. And there isn't really one single publication. I've got a slew of translations, and if you combine them all, then you can start to get a like a handle on the various meanings. But if you really want to get a handle, there's nothing like knowing the original language. So even though there might not be one specific word which substitutes for the other, if you learn what half a dozen different substitutions are, you have a lot more flexibility in interpreting what's going on. And speaking of interpreting what's going on, you really need to utilize the commentators. the classic, commentators. There's about a half a dozen who started writing in like the first, century AD and continued up until about the 15th, century. Maimonides is one. There's Rashi, there's Ibn Ezra, there's Nachmanides. So there's a handful of these commentators, and it's true you cannot read the score, or what's the expression in baseball? You can't keep score without a scorecard. I'm not sure what the expression is. But you can't understand the Bible without the commentators. Without the commentators, it's like what's this? What's it talking about? So you can understand the language, but still, you need to be able to know what the language is saying.
So, a couple more questions before we wrap up. How would one use the Old Testament Hebrew Bible to kind of guide them through their psychedelic experiences, or how could one be informed by the Hebrew Bible in relation to their psychedelic experiences?
Well, if you really want to go for it, the Hebrew Bible, read it all the way through with the commentators. There's a calendar by which you can by means of which you can read the entire Torah once a year. That's the first 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And I started reading the Torah in 1996. And I've gone, and I've read through it every year. So it's a constant companion. That's the first thing I do in the morning, is I study for 30 to 60 minutes. And it's the same stuff, like year after year after year after year. So I try to keep a new commentary open every year. So I can learn what somebody else is interpreting the text on a saying, or what the narratives actually are describing. I wouldn't recommend that for everyone, but that's what I do. And read the prophets and understand what they're saying and the way they attain prophecy. They're humble. They praise God. They hope for the success of their people. They want peace. They want prosperity. They want happiness. So the prophets are towering figures, and if you can learn what they do in order to attain the prophetic state, how they interact with the divine, either angels or God, God's glory. Joshua, for example, when he's about to invade Canaan, during the conquest, he has a vision, one night of an angel, holding a sword. And Joshua isn't sure what this means, and he says quite straightforwardly, "Are you with us, or are you against us?" And it turns out it was one of God's angels, and it was a positive vision. So you can learn how to interact with the content of the psychedelic experience. That's one thing. Through learning the tools of the trade. The other is to fill your mind with spiritual thoughts, spiritual ideas, spiritual narratives. The Golden Rule is the main interpersonal teaching of the Hebrew Bible, and the existence of one and only one God is the major belief which is taught by the Bible. So you can work with those for the rest of your life, and that's what the text is basically talking about, is the results of one kind of interpersonal interactions, and the results of another kind, or the results in serving other gods, or serving one God. So everything is contained in the Golden Rule and the one and only God.
Definitely.
Yeah, it refers to, or it goes back to become a spiritual person, and then your trips will be more spiritual.
Well, unfortunately, my battery life is about to die right here. So, is there any last words you want to leave the audience with? This has been a fascinating conversation. Where would you direct people, or what are any last words that you have?
Yeah, well, if any of your listeners want to make contact, I have a website, rickstrassman.com, and I've got a couple of pages on Facebook, and I answer pretty much every email that comes my way. You can buy my books on my website. I'm doing a webinar in a couple of months through a group in Sedona called the Psychedelic Religion of Prophetic Consciousness, which is meant to counter the meme that is influencing psychedelic psychotherapy these days of this psychedelic religion of mystical consciousness, like the white light, all is one. All you have to do is transcend. So the prophetic state isn't any of those things. But I think because it isn't, it addresses the most common psychedelic experiences, which are interactive. So register for that. Buy my books. Ask me questions. Those kinds of things. You can do all of those on my website or on Facebook.
Beautiful. Well, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it, and I really love this conversation. So, thank you.
Okay, sure. You're welcome. Thank you. Bye.